Hello, everybody. You're reading with Jimmy. We just read Lysistrata, and this is the summary, background, and interpretation of what is really a classic piece of literature, and I hope you agree with me. So let's get started. This is a comedy, not a tragedy. It's a comedy. So what happened? Well, it was written by Aristophanes and set during the Peloponnesian War, where the city-states of Athens and Sparta, with their allies, have been fighting each other for many years. I gave you some of that in the introduction. The play is the story of Lysistrata, who comes up with a plan to end the war. Her plan involves convincing the women of both Athens and Sparta, throughout the whole of Greece, actually, to withhold sex strike, from their husbands until they agree to negotiate for peace. Lysistrata rallies the women. They barricade themselves in the Acropolis until the demands are met. So this play is really a battle of the sexes. Women challenge the traditional role in ancient Greek society. So you have to really have an idea of what those roles were, maybe not, in order to fully appreciate the comedy. We don't want to stray too far outside the story, but we need some reference since it's 4,000 plus years old. In fact, there's a lot to absorb and think about, and as we will see in our notes about the translation that we have read. Lysistrata offers a humorous, thought-provoking commentary. I think it does, on many levels, like all classic literature. Remember, classical literature or literature is language charged with meaning, which we're going to talk about in this analysis. So the absurdity of war, the nature of power, the roles of women and men in society, and it uses body language in humorous situations. I hope you read it with me, as delivered by the translator, and some really outrageous situations to demonstrate its point of view. And like all plays, Aristophanes' play is in the third person narration, meaning there's no one in the story narrating to the audience, although some of the characters do, in fact, talk to the audience, if you recall. In the meantime, what we do through the third-person narrator is we overhear dialogue, we watch action, and the action is critical, especially in this play, to understanding how and what happens in the play. So reading Lysistrata actually was not an easy task, so this is for everybody who read it with me. It's really not easy doing these types of 4,000 plus year old plays. However, especially when you don't speak Greek, right? Let's examine a little bit of background of the times for some deeper analysis of the play. You always want to you are encouraged to go back and reread, re-listen to it with Jimmy if you'd like after this analysis, or you don't have to, whatever you want. Remember, this background is not necessary to understand what is in the play or the story. Some of the background we'll be talking about here is not necessary to understand what happens in this play, which we just summarized. You can stay inside the play entirely, but you got to really understand the references in the play, because Aristophanes uses languages through his third-person narrator. And a lot of those references, if you don't know what Greek mythology is, for example, you're going to miss a lot of the story. So, unlike starting with the plot to help you appreciate what you just read, I wanted to begin with the language of the play. Now, why? You'll remember that, first of all, language, or diction, as Aristotle says, is one of the six main elements of tragedy or comedy: plot, character, diction, thought, spectacle, and song, of which the first two are primary. In comedy, the plot and character are still important, but language, especially in this comedy, I believe, has to be considered more important, and here's why. The translator of this edition of Lysistrata is Stephen Halliwell, and he's a professor of Greek at the University of St. Andrew, and he explains himself in the introduction the difficulty of translating the play, including one, Aristophanes' verse encompasses many different forms and registers, frequently extracting humor from odd combinations. So I am not a Greek scholar by any means. I did study Latin when I was in high school, But Latin's a dead language, and Greek is not so much dead, but Greek, the way it was said in those days, is probably different than the Greek of today. So Helliwell is telling us that he's using many different forms, and the translator has to take educated guesses at what Aristophanes or the third person narrator was saying. Pardon me. Large areas of humor are inextricably tied with verbal details of imagery, puns, and other kinds of wordplay, which do not readily lend themselves to effective translations. If you speak 2 or 3 or 4 languages, if you speak another language rather than just English, you know that there's certain things in language that you can't it's just impossible almost to translate, right? Because every language is different. Every language has their own unique set of things. And sometimes if you've ever watched, what the hell is that show? I can't even remember it now. I'll think of it. But there's always translating problems. So you want to get a good translator edition if you're going to read some of these older books, which we do. If you've been with me for a while, you know that I read a certain translator of Maupassant who wrote in French. And finally, number 3, old comedy. That's their classification of what this is. They call it old comedy. I don't know why, nor do I care. Is saturated with historically specific references to people, places, institutions, and that creates problems even for the most classical readers in antiquity. In other words, there's no reference point to what is being said. This is very important, especially with a guy like Aristophanes, who I'm told used to love puns, used to use names of people that existed or disguise the names. Only the names were changed to protect the innocent. I don't think they did that much in those days. They just called it like it is. So Helliwell notes the demands of comic effectiveness and historical accuracy make competing and often irreconcilable demands. In other words, you're trying to be effective, you're trying to be accurate, but you're trying to show the humor, and sometimes that just doesn't work. So he's explaining, he's not apologizing for the translation that we read. What he's doing is explaining to you what he did as a translator. When I did my thesis and for my master's degree, I had to do the same thing. I was translating something from actually the Revolutionary War. It was a manuscript in Britain. It was a play. And when my mentor, the great Father Larkin, brought over that manuscript to help, and get me my dissertation, I had to do this. I had to do what Helliwell did, only with English, because, like I said, I studied Latin, but I have enough trouble with English, as you saw from some of my pronunciations of these people, these names. I'm better with Dostoevsky. Anyway, translating language to English is always a challenge. For example, you'll remember this little scene here when they're taking the oath. I'm not going to read it all to you, but as they take the oath when they're going to swear to deny sex to shall come near me with prick erect. And then they repeat, and they repeat, they repeat. They repeat all these things. But if he uses force and tries to rape me, I'll still resist and never wither with pleasure. So this type of translation, as we talked about with the swear words that are used in here, which I'm sure they were used in those times. But it depends on the translator. I've seen this word, translated as penis. I'm going to show you in a moment where they didn't even translate this word. So what you want to do is you want to really understand the value of a translation. I went through 3 translations before I settled on Helliwell for you, including going to AI, which is readily available these days, and having them translate the Greek directly for me, which was an interesting experiment. So there's a lot of time that's put in behind these classic pieces of literature that I'm reading with you that I don't necessarily want to tell you about, but there it is. But I did pull a translation I had for many years, or one of the early books I bought when I was a young man, by Blanche Yorka, who's also a Greek scholar. And this is hers. And I'm going to blow this up a little bit so that you can take a look at it. And I found the same place where they're taking the oath, right? How much, well, then, the husband and lover come flaming with desire. Though husband or lover come flaming with desire. That's talking about the same thing that we just read up here, right? With prick erect. So this translation here avoids that word completely. And if you read it, and I'm not going to read it all, it's softly amorous perfume robed in voluptuous folds, so that seemingly I would melt in his hot embrace. It reads more like a, novel than it does translating. Blah, 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 blah. He shall have no jolt of joy in me. By still sheer strength overpower me, like ice I lie, inviolate as the dead. And if he should overpower me, I shall resist and never wither with pleasure. I'll never lift my sexy legs up high. You see the difference? So it's up to the translator to really convey what he believes, what she believes is going on in Lysistrata. So you can see translations do make a difference. And unless you read original Greek, and even if you do, this is Old Greek, and we're going to read Beowulf one day in Chaucer, I promise. And when I take you into the world of Beowulf, which is early English, it's more German than it is English because of what the Anglo-Saxons were. You're at the mercy of the translator, so always be careful that you get a good translation. And you can ask around, you can ask Google, what's the best translation? They might tell you. But what you want to do is just read for yourself certain sections and see what you think. And also listen to a podcast. I'm going to refer to you to a podcast about Lysistrata. Okay. So there are many people today that believe you should be editing English. This is important. I want to call the reason I brought up translations is that I think it's very important to understand what a translator from a different language goes through, because that's what's going on today with English. There's certain goofballs that believe that you can actually edit English. In other words, you can take out words you don't like. You can change what the narrator, the author wrote. That's BS, B, capital B, period, capital S, period. And that's a huge mistake. So, for example, some people think you have to dumb down Shakespeare in order to understand Shakespeare, or you have to take certain words out of Huckleberry Finn because they're offensive. Would you forget about that and would you grow up? Classical literature, charged with meaning, you read what the author wrote in the book. We've already read some stories, basically in English, that had some words in there that might make you uncomfortable. Ladies and gentlemen, you should never be uncomfortable with words because you can close the book. When Jimmy was a teacher in high school, they were talking at a parent conference meeting, and one of the mothers was complaining that she couldn't get Johnny, whatever his name was, to stop watching television. And there was a truck driver father at the table, looked like a very rugged individual, and listening very calmly, didn't make any comments, was smoking cigarettes, which was allowed in those days at these meetings. And he calmly listened, and she was bemoaning her fate. And I said, well, you just got to work with him. I'm trying to be a teacher in the middle there, right? And he put his cigarette out and he says, why don't you just turn the television off? And the woman was silent. Apparently, maybe she never thought of that. In any case, never words, sticks and stones will hurt my bones, but names will never hurt me. If you don't want to read something, then don't read it. But if you do read a classical piece of literature, I'm not talking about pornography, I'm not talking about crap, I'm talking about classical literature, and you come across a word that you don't like, well, forget about it for the moment because that's there for a reason. That word was put in there for a reason. Classical literature does not waste words. You're going to see that over and over and over again. Every word counts. In translation, it especially counts because you're trying to translate the intent of the author into English. So you're double charged. You're not just reading an English word that you don't like and say, oh, I don't like that word, I'm going to change it. Don't change the original word. In translating into English, it's very difficult. You've got to be a linguist, right? So stay inside the story. The world doesn't go around you. It doesn't go around you. You and I are part of the world and we exist in the world together. So trying to bend everything and everyone to your will, well, it's selfish and it's a huge mistake. It's like trying to bend math to your will. You can't bend math. You bend to math, right? You're not going to learn algebra by trying to say, well, let's just make it easier so everybody can understand it. So you never really grow and appreciate classic literature if you think everyone has to think like you. That's a big mistake. Many people make it. They think, I still am troubled why people don't think like me. I don't let it bother me that much. Better to read and reject than not read, or read something someone has edited, for you and think you are reading the original. That's the worst thing that can happen to you, is you reading something that has been edited down, dumbed down. Halliwell goes on for many pages explaining the difficulty of doing this kind of translating, but it should not prohibit us from enjoying it or trusting the translator. I believe this is one of the best translations. One of his statements is very important for us to understand. While it is desirable to make Aristophanes as accessible as possible, accessibility must involve access to something that is not our own. You understand that? I hope you understand that. That's true of all classical literature, Renaissance literature, English literature, French literature. The comic pleasure, which and still be obtained from these plays by modern readers, depends on the willingness to participate in a well-informed experience of historically different and even alien mode of drama. You're used to watching television, streaming, right, on Netflix and Prime and all that other stuff, and movies and episodes. That's not what this is. I told you when we started reading this is a play that was done in a setting in Greece on the side of a mountain where people sat on boards on the mountaintop looking down at the orchestra area where these actors came out. And by the way, for historical reference, there were no women that played these parts. Women in Greek society at that time, they had a different role. They didn't have talk about not having a vote. They didn't do much. We're going to talk about that in a minute. So not that that's important to understanding this. You can picture Lysistrata as a woman, which she is, but in the play itself, in Greek society, all these parts, the men chorus, the women chorus, the men leader, the woman leader, Lysistrata herself was played by a man, and they use masks. So you have, I hope that shouldn't depreciate your understanding or appreciation of this play, because we read it, we didn't see it. And if we did see it, or if it was staged, I assure you, not all men would play this, right? They're going to put women in these roles. So bend to the play. Not bend the play to you. Don't bend this play to you. Bend yourself to the play. Jimmy thinks Halliwell did a great job. What he wrote is true of every piece of literature. bend to it, and it'll give you great pleasure. Reread it again. Just pick up a copy too. If you don't want to read with me, read it yourself. So what was Greek society like back then? I gave you a lot of that in the introduction, where the play was staged outdoors. More than likely, he entered this play in a contest. There were 3 plays that were shown in The Winner Gets Fame and Fortune. If you really want a little bit more of information on Lysistrata, the BBC has a wonderful podcast series called In Our Time. And ironically, last week or the week before, they covered Lysistrata. One of my friends, who turned me on to these podcasts from In Our Time, mentioned that when I mentioned to her that I'm reading Lysistrata, she said, "Oh, they covered it in this podcast." So I listened to it, and it's very good. It gives you a nice background, takes you inside and outside the play. Here's the actual link that you can copy for yourself. So this is a good discussion around it. In any case, you should know Greek society was the foundation for what became our Western civilization. The Greeks, followed by the Romans. That's what our founding fathers in the United States actually were students of Greek and Latin and Roman civilizations. They were deep thinkers, as we all should be. And that's one of the reasons I started this series, is I think deep thinking is missing, regardless of your age. Well, Jimmy, this isn't really children's literature. Well, depends how much of a child you are, right? Kids today with these phones are a lot smarter than I was when I was their age. But if you're not ready for it, some people... Dostoevsky is the toughest novelist, but the best novelist I've ever read in my life. I couldn't read him until I got to college in my senior year. I tried, but I couldn't read him. You have to be ready to read. You can't just pick up a book, unless you're Mozart, right? And, oh, I'm gifted, I'm smart. So you have to be ready for these messages. And that's what the Greeks did. They laid down the body. They were thinkers, they were rational. They discovered, right, mathematics. Well, wait a minute, didn't the Arabs do that? Of course they did. But, the Greeks built on it. And don't forget, the Macedonians, which were Greek also, Alexander the Great, conquered most of the world at that time. So if you don't understand a lot of what is happening around you today, I would suggest respectfully, that's because you don't really know what happened way back when, right? So you can reject it once you understand it. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not force-feeding you to do anything. Well, of course, you can't make me do anything. Of course I can't. It's up to you. I used to tell students when I teach, I can't make you do anything. I can't teach you anything. What do you mean you can't? You're a teacher. No, teaching was really cajoling. It's really not teaching. It's kind of like helping out. You have to be ready for messages. And that's why impressionable young people today, I believe, are lacking, because they don't really get these great pieces of literature, which have been not only created with much thought, with great thought, but they're dumbed down. So they don't get a chance to really stress their minds, right? When you limit your thinking, you are, in fact, less free. I could prove that to you very easily. If you can't think about what I think about, you can't think, right? You're less free. If I can think about what you think about, I'm as free as you are, theoretically. So the more you can think about, the more free you are. It's a proven fact. I'll give you the Schopenhauer definition of freedom later on. In fact, knowing what happened in the past helps you make huge, if you not knowing what happened in the past, you're going to make huge mistakes. If you judge what's happening now and you say, well, what is this? If you look in the past, I'm going to tell you, chances are something happened. There's a saying, there's nothing new under the sun, right? You've heard that? There isn't. There's variations on a theme. I worked with a great art director who not only believed that, we used to argue about it, and he eventually proved it to me. There's just variations. which we talked about. Anyway, and while there are many civilizations that built other societies, every country has a claim to their own. I'm not saying Greek civilization and Roman civilization are the civilizations, right? But I'm saying if you want to understand what's going on today in the world, you should really expose yourself to many civilizations, not just this one, not just Lysistrata. But Lysistrata is one of them. And we have to stay in the story in the literature we read. So in other words, a little, what's going around at the time, but stay inside the story. When you do that, as you saw from our reading, you have to look up many references, which Jimmy did for you, right? There's lots of notes on those pages, not just the notes from Helliwell, but my own notes to make sure you understand the words in the story. Because Helliwell, like all professors and all academics and all great translators, makes assumptions that we know what he knows or she knows, and we don't. So no one can know everything, right? I can go back and reread this and see more things than I saw when I read it with you just recently. But that's the beauty of great literature. You can't do that with just dime novels. I'm going to call them dime novels. You read them once, you throw it away, right? It's not great literature. It's not essential to know how Greek men and women acted day to day, but we have to know what is going on in this place. So it helps if you knew what the heck that society was like. And references are important, but you don't want to stay outside the story too much. You don't have to know about the Peloponnesian Wars, the Battle of Marathon. It helps if you know the Battle of Marathon and the guy who ran 26 miles and then died as he told about the victory. It helps if you know not just from the movie, the 300 Spartans, but you read about Leonidas, right? But you don't have to understand Lysistrata. The third person narrator opens up by telling that Lysistrata is pacing up and down with growing impatience. See that here? Well, how would you show you're impatient? People pace. So the actor, the actress, right, the man would be pacing up and down with growing impatience, maybe pacing faster and faster, before the first word is spoken. The first direction the narrator gives us is that exasperated. She speaks and she says she's exasperated, which is intensely irritated, frustrated. So how do you show this? Well, you show it in the language. You show it in the delivery of the language. I'm going to take a sip of coffee. Hold on. Thank you. So she references Bacchae, Pan, and Aphrodite's shrine. There's no women, but if I were to hold that here, they'd be you wouldn't be able to move. They'd be all over here. So she's saying that if you looked up these things, which I'm going to tell you about in a moment, remember this is a play about sex, right? Note the pronoun they would be invited. Remember, the audience doesn't know what's going on yet. Lysistrata said if they had been invited to those three things, you wouldn't be able to move. So what are those things? Well, the Bacchae rites were religious ceremonies dedicated to Dionysus, Bacchus, god of wine, fertility, and ecstasy. These rituals involve music, dancing, drinking wine excessively, and wild behavior. Bacchic, right? So that's one of them. And if the women went there, they wouldn't be able to move. That's an implication. Women are sex. They want sex. The grotto of Pan, who's Pan, can be considered an ancient point of anything goes sexuality. This is not Jimmy saying this. This is the definition of Pan's grotto. The cave waters fed by the Jordan River were so plentiful that the center of the cave was considered bottomless, which the Greeks would throw their sacrifices to this half-man, half-goat god, throw it in. They believed it was bottomless. The temple of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, was a place in which Aphrodite would be intimate with her sacred prostitutes. In this temple, women would enter with the intention of performing sexual activities for payment. which they would then provide to the temple. They would give the temple money. So when Lysistrata says, now remember, you're in the audience, you're in a Greek society, even if you're here, if you're in today's society, and now that you know what those three things are, you talk about literature as language charged with meaning. Now that you know what those three things are, you get a whole new attitude towards what she's saying here. And she's basically implying that women are like nymphomaniacs. They're just crazy about sex, right? And I don't know about you, but when Jimmy was growing up, the way sometimes it was told when you're trying to get the attention of people at a meeting, all you have to do is hold up the word sex, S-E-X, and everybody pays attention. It was a little gimmick. I never used it, but I saw some people use it. And they would hold it up when they're addressing a now that I have your undivided attention, sex sells. You've heard that saying, right? So that got the attention of the Greek audience immediately. You can see the narrator tees up the audience with what Lysistrata says here. If we're at these other things, for sure. In other words, women love sex in this play, or are portrayed as loving sex. And in those days, when there's no phones, no television, right? Who wouldn't? Which is important to the plot, because that's exactly, I hate the word precisely, what Lysistrata asks them to give up to secure the peace. Whoops, peace. No pun intended. All right. They love sex. Lysistrata said, you got to give up sex. You see, there's an immediate conflict. Beautiful, isn't it? So what is she up to? Kellenic shows up, confirms these things that reflect the society. Note the dash in the sentence. I dare say some are getting their husbands -up. See that here? Some are getting their husbands up. You think that she's referring to waking them up? Or do you think that's referring to something else trying to get up? Well, I would say it's something besides waking them up because of what she's talking about. And the same thing is following when Lysistrata is describing her idea, which is really withholding sex for peace. Lysistrata says, it's big. This idea, before she reveals what the idea is, she says it's big. And Kellenic suggestively says, and beefy? She's not talking about a hot tub. Lysistrata, it's beefy, all right. Now, the word beefy coming from Kellenic's mouth is different than the word beefy coming from Lysistrata's mouth. This means one thing, this means another. It doesn't mean the same thing, does it? Kellenic, well, it sounds worth coming for. Lysistrata, it's not like that. It's not like that. Or else they would all be here. So it's not sex. It's not sexual. Although Kellenic sees everything as sexual. So these sexual suggestions get people very much attuned into what the narrator through Aristophanes, through his third person narrator, tells us. Lampito, by the twins, I swear I could. My exercise includes rump stretching kicks. The twins are Castor and Pollux. Remember when they swear oaths? Kellenic, I've never seen a finer pair of breasts. I've never. And she's feeling those breasts. Lampito, stop feeling my flesh. I am not for sacrifice. They were, well, Jimmy, they don't do that nowadays, right? Really? Really? Of course, they don't do that, but what do they do? And what about the other girl? Who's she? Abotian. By the twin, she's come for the meeting too. Murine. Oh, her belly's as flat as blah, 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 blah. So the license is surrounding something the women value and in society that they live in, and that is to withhold sex to secure the peace. Only they understand that when the women that come there finally get it, when they finally understand what Lysistrata is asking them to do, they strongly object. I simply couldn't. The war must take its course. So you see what I'm saying? So, well, Jimmy, is that true? It doesn't matter if it's true. The character is saying that it's true. Forget whether you believe you could do it or not. Forget whether you believe this at all. Just follow the story. Kellenic, who's demonstrated she's like sex, right? She's saying, I couldn't do this. I could not abstain. Murine, I feel the same. The war must take its course. Just let it go. Let it go. And she says, well, that's your view, you flat fish. Just before you said you'd even cut yourself in half. She says, ask anything else. I'm prepared to walk through fire, but to give up the prick? Well, Jimmy, people talk like that? Well, they did there. The translator could have said, but not give up sex. But he translated it prick. What should he have done? Do you think that's the right word? Can you read Greek? Can you teach yourself to read Greek and go back and read that portion? You can get side-by-side translations of the Greek. You can ask Google to translate it if you'd like to, which is sometimes I did. So as I'm telling you this, remember, sex is really the key to this and what makes it so hilarious. So she convinces them, they swear the oath. And in those days, the oath was very important. And the play unfolds. So what about this social structure that the Greeks had? There were citizens, medics, resident foreigners, right? And slaves. Citizens, which were basically the men, male landowners. Women were not there. They were just there, right? They had no rights. Slaves, typically captured in warfare or born into slavery. And slavery is so horrible. Of course it is. Is it really? I'm a slave to love. What is slavery, right? That's when you're bondage, right? The Jews were in bondage by the Egyptians for many, many years, right? There's slavery now. Just pick some of the countries. Look at some of the countries in the world. You're going to see slavery. It's a bad thing. But in those days, that's one of the things they did, right? You can be against slavery. I'm against slavery. We can all be against slavery. But who cares what we're against? This is what was going on in those times. And you have to understand that if you're going to understand anything. That's what education is. That's what thinking is. That's what appreciation is. You see in the play, no one today likes the word slave, but it existed. It still does. Citizenship was exclusive, limited to free-born males who were Athenian descent. Spartans were different. Spartan had a military thing. In Sparta, for example, stealing was encouraged. And if you got caught stealing, you were punished, not because you stole, but because you got caught. From an early age, all you have to do is watch the 300 Spartans if you don't want to read about it. From an early age, they were taught to fight. Everybody fought. Everybody was taught to fight. Everybody. The saying, on your shield, right? Or bring your shield back, or come back on your shield. Very, very different type of thinking than what we do. Strict definitions were involved. Men hold the primary authority. Women were responsible for domestic duties and had limited legal rights and participation. And you saw that in the play. You saw when they take over the Acropolis, you saw the commissioner come in and all those old men with logs, they were going to burn them out. There was no way they're going to let women talk to them like that, right? Who are these women? And if you remember when women got to vote in America, it was the same thing. Women were relegated to second-class citizens. Well, aren't they? They're first class, right, Jimmy? Well, yeah, but do we treat women like that? Or are they equal? What does equal mean? What does that mean? So they were expected to be obedient to their husbands and maintain honor and reputation of the family. Well, who isn't? You don't have to be a woman to want that. They were polytheistic. Polytheistic. They believed in more than one God. They had many gods. They believed gods and gods. They worshipped in Mount Olympus. The Greeks were the first one to fashion their gods in their own image, right? Christians reverse that sometimes, right? Religious festivals were an integral part of life. Temples and sanctuaries were dedicated to various deities. If you're going to understand anything about Greek literature, if we're going to read some more, which we will, you got to understand Greek mythology. Their mythology, the gods that they believed in. And then warfare. This was central in Greek society. City-states frequently fought each other. You had many, besides Athens and Sparta, which were the big ones, you had a lot of little ones, and they were always fighting each other, right? There are references to gods and goddesses in this play. And the more you know about what these people believed, the more appreciation. By the twins, they're always swearing oaths to God. Jimmy pointed out during the reading many of these references, but I felt it's worthwhile to review some of these things. Zeus was the top god, right? Athena was the goddess of wisdom and strategy and warfare. So Athena was both temple, there were temples to her. Poseidon was the god of the sea. These all had equivalents when Romans became the power. When Romans came to power, all of these gods had a translation in Roman, right? Zeus was Jupiter. Poseidon was Neptune. Athena was, I forgot who she was. And Hera and Dionysus, those are just a few. And then they had heroes. Heroes from mythology and stories, and these references enriched the backdrop of the play. So these people were heroes. They were usually, heroes were part, regular and part God. A god would come down to earth, fart around with a person, and then the result was a hero, half God, half man, right? And some of those heroes are Hercules, one of the most famous, Achilles, Agamemnon, Odysseus. That doesn't mean Odysseus was half God, half man, because he was just a famous hero. And if you don't know who Odysseus is, the Roman word was Ulysses. He's the guy who had the Trojan horse. He's the guy who actually won the Trojan War for the Greeks. And Agamemnon was the leader of that. Anyway, my head is spinning. So let's continue with the analysis. Aristotle, which I always like to refer to, differentiates between comedy and tragedy. By the way, if you have any questions, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. I'm taking another sip of coffee. So what is comedy? Comedy represents human beings worse than they are. Aristotle notes that they're just ridiculous and laughable. And I think you could see that was true in Lysistrata. Not all the time, but certainly the men were acting a little ridiculous, right? Aristotle said about tragedy is true of comedy. Those 6 things are still relevant, right? So the plot we discussed, the characters are less developed than in a tragedy, though Lysistrata is pretty well developed. For example, one of her characteristics is she's determined. She's very determined, right? There's about 14,588 words, not about, but if you count all the direction as well. Aristotle says a successful plot should have a single unifying theme that drives everything forward. Lysistrata meets this criteria, right? Because the theme is basically men versus women. We're going to stop the war by stopping sex. According to Healthline, sexual desire is one of the strongest human needs and a complex topic. Of course it is. But one of the best ways to look at this conflict, this unity of action, I believe, Jimmy believes, is through Abraham Maslow. This was an American psychologist. He created a hierarchy of needs. This is very important. You can look it up and discuss it, but I'm going to show you what that means. This was his theory that, and there's arguments about this, whether it's still relevant. You know, whenever a guy creates a wonderful way of thinking about things over time, he loses relevance for whatever reason. Science comes along and crushes his thought. But if you really take care to read what they talk about and balance it in your mind with what you're hearing as quote unquote science, like that science did us a lot of good during COVID, didn't it? As you're finding out now. I'm not going to go there. In any case, his hierarchy of needs is very important, and I wanted to show you that. Here it is. Maslow believed that it starts here, and unless you satisfy these needs, you don't really move up to the next. And once you satisfy these needs and those needs, you move up to the next. And then you move up to the next, and then you move up here. There's a blog about this that basically the internet gave us a chance, because it's the internet, to bypass all this stuff and go right to self-actualization, which is bullshit. Some people, although I know, give up sleep, right, to be on the internet, which is crazy. Look at the physiological needs, breathing, food. If you can't breathe, if I said, I'm going to take away, your air for a few minutes, you'd stop, unless you got to keep listening to me, or I'm going to take away your air right now. So you got to breathe. You got to have food, water, sex, sleep, exertion, excretion. You got to go to the, bathroom. You can't stop. Well, Jimmy, I'm never going to go to the bathroom again. Good luck. You see what I'm saying? And then you got to feel safe. You got to feel safe. If you don't feel safe, how can you think great thoughts? How can you understand Lysistrata? So think about this, and what Aristophanes with his third person narrator settled on is this right here, right? Physiological. He stayed right there. He didn't worry about great thoughts. He didn't worry about morality. He didn't worry about any of this stuff, self-esteem. He just entertained people. He stayed here. And usually that's called body, right? That's body comedy. Marx Brothers. If you watch a Marx Brothers movie, you're not thinking about self-esteem. you're just laughing your butt off, right? So Lysistrata's comedy stops at the first level. It exaggerates the need for sex, or doesn't, and holds up a mirror to Greek society. So what's the theme of Lysistrata? Well, there are many themes you can walk away with in any good piece of literature, including comedy, which stays at the first level. You can conclude how stupid war is, why men treat women like they did, during our time. But you read classics to find out how others lead their life and how we should lead our own. If you're driven by any of these needs here, sometimes you can't think straight, right? If you've ever been hungry, you can ask my wife. When I get hungry, something happens to me. And I'm not talking about really, really hungry. I'm just talking about hungry. If you're really, for example, if you can't breathe, you're gonna go into conniption fits, right? Suddenly somebody cut off your air, or if you've ever been involved in a fire and you're breathing smoke and you can't breathe, you stop thinking about everything except getting your breath. See what I'm saying? So as you think about this comedy and they hold up these sexual bodiness, think about that. That's something to think about. War. One of the central themes of this is war and how horrible it is. Well, Jimmy, why did Aristophanes, through the third person narrator, make it funny? He's trying to make a joke out of it. Well, I don't know if he's trying to make a joke out of war. He's just trying to say that wouldn't it be nice if you could end the war, right? Anybody who thinks you should not end war, go back and read Sun Tzu, right? The way you win a battle is not to fight. It's over before you even begin the fight. I'm not going to get into that. Plot always involves character development. Lysistrata meets this criteria through the third person narrator and mainly Lysistrata. She develops her character. Determination, we talked about that. So what do you think? What do you think about the play? Jimmy at readingwithjimmy.com, reading with Jimmy, Jimmy at readingwithjimmy.com. So if we read classical literature to find out how other people lead their lives and how to lead ours, what did we learn on how to lead our lives here? What did you learn? Well, that's up to you. I can't tell you what you learned, just like I can't teach you anything. Just like, right? You got to understand that and walk away with something for yourself. One of the things I have always learned when I read this play is to laugh at myself. If you can't laugh at yourself, or you can't laugh at this, and that's why before we leave, I wanted to talk about comedy for a moment. Comedy pokes fun at us. Great comics, when they're great. Nowadays, people are kind of like stupid. They're not really comedians, but the great comics, and you can see some of the clips on YouTube of the great comics. They poke fun at situations, including ourselves. And in the interpretation of dreams by Sigmund Freud, many preliminary connections between psychic process and the production of dreams with the production of humor. In dreams, which I love, dreams are good for you. But again, Freud is one of those guys that fell out of vogue, right, over time. But he argues that jokes resemble dreams. You've heard of the Freudian slip? Oh, that's a Freudian slip. You make a slip, a comment that comes out the truth. Jokes resemble dreams. They're kind of like fantastic, right? They operate by condensing meanings and substituting signs. That's what dreams do. They mix it all up. That's what comedians do. They mix it all up. There's puns. The same word comes to stand for two things, like we talked about with beefy. There's a guy named Martin Billig of Lowbrow University pointed out that humor is universal. It's in every society. And if you think about it, man is the only animal that can smile. There's no animal that I know of. Do you know? Well, Jimmy, my dog smiles. No, I don't think so. I don't think they smile. We smile. Yet there's nothing universally funny. You can take the same joke and tell it somewhere else, which is why jokes are really not funny all the time. Because I don't find things funny. But when you read Lysistrata with me, I can't think of you not seeing that as funny, right? It's a funny play. There's words in there that mean 18 different things. There's situations. When those guys are trying to burn out and they're choking on the smoke and fire, just the fact that she's trying to stop the war by denying men sex, just that thought has to be ridiculous, but yet funny. Or is it possible? So some people will find Lysistrata not funny. Well, why would that be? Why would you not find this play funny? Well, Jimmy, there's cultural and individual differences. I just didn't laugh. Okay, good luck. Hopefully you'll read something else on my website. But I don't care who you are. When you listen to that podcast, if you do, those people were saying it's very hard to stage this play nowadays. And it is. And why is that? Because, ladies and gentlemen, we've lost our sense of humor. We've lost our ability to laugh at ourselves, at other things, and just laugh. Well, Jimmy, so war is not funny. How can you laugh at war? Not saying to laugh at war. War is not funny. It's tragic, right? The death of anybody is tragic, correct? Of course. But laughter is very important. If you do one thing, you can't just do one thing. Aristotle always taught moderation. So if you're always walking around, hey, life sucks, If you do that all the time, well, of course it's going to suck, right? And while it's certainly true, these people forget that it's critically important to laugh at ourselves, right? Jimmy would argue that being able to laugh at yourself, at what you do, what you don't do, what you forget to do, is the essence of being a human being. Animals don't laugh. Oh, you mean they don't feel joy? I didn't say that. I said they don't laugh. You got to be able to laugh. And when you can't laugh, you become serious. And there's nothing wrong with being serious. But if you take yourself too seriously, that leads to problems, doesn't it? Well, Jimmy, I'm sick. I've got a disease. Well, I'm sorry, and I feel bad. But it's part of, everything is part of the life we live, right? Anyway, there can be politics involved, morality, of course, aesthetics, of course. And humor is social, right? You don't go to a funeral and laugh, right? You go to a funeral, and if you laugh, you're looked at as an oddball. What the hell are you laughing at? Right? So situations determine laughter. One of my favorite quotes is a famous writer, Rabelais, who said, "It's better to write of laughter than of tears, for laughter is the essence of mankind." And he was right. And that's what Lysistrata is all about. Laughter. Pure, unadulterated laughter at others and at ourselves. One more thing. Sorry. There's a lot of references in this play to local people, blah, 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 blah. And the difficulty in trying to stage this play nowadays, because if you try to stage this play as written, as translated by in any translation, you're going to have a problem because people are just not, they don't relate. And the example that I want to give you to keep in mind is the Rorschach test. Who is Robert Redford? I had a intern at our company several years ago. We were talking, and the name Robert Redford came out, and I was using the example of Jeremiah Johnson to this young lady. And she said, "Who's Robert Redford?" Some of you out there are saying, "Who is Robert Redford?" So it was at that moment, I said to myself, I'm really old, or something is rotten in Denmark. Something's really off here if you don't know who Robert Redford is. And then I thought a little bit further that, of course, she doesn't know. How could you know who Robert Redford is unless you saw some movies, right? So reference points are very important. The next day she came in, by the way, and she said, "I think I will see Jeremiah Johnson and some of his other movies." She looked them up because, young people carry their phones everywhere. And all you have to do is Google and ask Siri something, and they'll tell you exactly who that is. So there's a great advantage to gaining knowledge these days from having that phone in your hand. But with due respect, you got to know what to ask about. You got to know what to ask. If you don't know what to ask, you're not gonna get any of the answers you want. You know this from your searches in Google. If you Google, like, what is life? You're going to get a whole bunch of crap, right? But the more specific you are in your question to Google, the more results you're going to get. Okay, I'm not going to leave you with these things. These are other things here. You've been reading with Jimmy. This is my analysis of Lysistrata. Thank you for visiting. Please visit our website often and go back and read it. We've got a lot of hours on this website, I'm told. Reading with Jimmy, Jimmy at readingwithjimmy.com is my email. Look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you so much. Again, send me your emails. By the way, a lot of this analysis was answering some of the emails that I got from you already. Keep them coming.